Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us at Space Cowboy Books Online. I am your host, Jean-Paul Garnier, and tonight we are here with Ai Jiang, author of I Am I, a wonderful, perfect palindrome, a fabulous book. Even my cat loves it and ate the corner off of it. So cat approved as well, which is a good sign. Ai Jiang is a Chinese-Canadian writer, a Nebula Award finalist, and an immigrant from Fujian. She's a member of HWA, SFWA, and Codex. Her work can be found in fantasy and science fiction, the dark, and uncanny, among others. She is the recipient of the Odyssey Workshop's 2022 Fresh Voices Scholarship and the author of Ling Huen and I Am I, of course. We had I on the program a while back when Ling Huen came out, another wonderful novel, but this one is very different, very science fiction, where the last one was horror. So I'm going to hand it over to I to do a reading for us, and then we'll get into a Q&A. If you have any questions during the event, please feel free to drop them in the chat, and we'll try to get to them all. Over to you, I.
All right. Well, thank you to everyone for coming along. So first, I will be reading the beginning of I Am I. It's becoming difficult and dangerous to ignore my battery's rapid rundown time. At 8%, my memory functions are diminishing far too quickly. I've forgotten to charge before leaving work again. For me, forgetting is a dangerous thing. I hope the glitches don't cause a sudden short circuiting. The notification for my postponed for half a year maintenance glares from the watch implanted into my wrist. I press snooze, my fingers trembling. I can't afford the bi-monthly checkups. I'll need to replace my battery soon. Replacing my brain for a system that works faster, that limits errors, and doesn't cause memory gaps becomes more appealing with each passing day. AIs don't have a fear of overworking, of needing sleep to prevent any fatigue. My hands shake at the prospect of finally getting rid of the one thing outside my brain that hinders my productivity. To think my emotions will soon become a muted thing. I can't tell if I'm afraid or eager. I'll be able to work faster. Joy and pain won't affect me in the same way. None of my neighbors know I die with my battery rather than my heart. Most of them still believe I'm more human than robot, half metal and circuits. Being less human makes life easier. Technology is convenient. It's more dependable as a life force, more predictable. Emotions, humanity, mortality, humans are such fragile things. A message from my mechanic Joan arrives, pinging my watch with an urgent tag. I've secured the battery we've been looking for to make the full heart replacement. You're booked in for tomorrow. I appreciate their straightforward tone, though a part of me wants us to become friends, given how long we've known each other. 3 years now, maybe four. I've lost track. But I suppose it will only become a nuisance to us both, draw us away from our focus if we care too much. I just have to hold on until tomorrow night. Another warning about my battery. I dismiss it and scramble to leave, grabbing my jacket flung into the corner of my 11-foot by 11-foot box-like unit to reach a charging port on time. I don't notice Auntie Nawani's entrance until she's long pushed her way into my unit's narrow space. I almost curse out loud as I mentally make a note to fix the lock. Auntie Nawani hovers by my elbow, trying to plug the clock she found last week into the port in my arm. I should be annoyed, but the feeling of familiarity, the sense of family she has somehow built in our community over time, even if we have no blood relation, comforts me. Sometimes I want nothing more than to collapse into Auntie Nawani, but to show such weakness will only create bad, time-costing habits I can't afford. Right now, I don't have the patience or battery life to entertain the elder's requests. Cold sweat wells at the base of my neck, collecting in the collar of my shirt, long due for a wash. Grime itches the parts of my back that remain skin rather than metal. I can almost hear my battery draining within me as the seconds tick past. Hold on a second. Just hold on a second. I don't have a second. Our arms flail, and I narrowly miss her head at the same time she accidentally sucker punches my shoulder. Cold air whisks down my lungs. I add shoulder plate to the list of replacements I will purchase when funds allow. She plugs the clock back in. The clock is precious to Auntie, but to me it only serves as a reminder of the time I'm losing, the stutters of my heart when the passing minutes appear as a looming countdown within my mind. The old thing had washed up ashore, waterlogged, paint half gone, with the seconds hand missing. A great find, she explained, even though cut herself on the jagged edges of rocks and soiled her shoes trying to reach it by the edge of the lake. It never lasts long enough for the alarm to go off at the time she set it for. Sometimes I feel like the clock, my energy levels and brain capacity always coming to a halt when I need the limitations removed most. The choking suffocation of imminent burnout, a faceless entity chasing me from behind with shadowy fingers, always just brushing the small of my back. I keep reminding her to toss it, to get a new watch, one that tells time without stuttering, but she never has. The protective coating of the broken clock's wire is barely there, like flesh hanging from exposed bones. If unlucky, we both could be electrocuted. Look how wonderful it is, Auntie Nawani insisted. There is a story behind this clock. Auntie! I swat her hand away once more, impulsively checking my battery again and again with each staccato movement. Just because I'm a cyborg, she sees me as both an endearing youth and a tool for her use, but sometimes it feels as though the latter is truer than the former. Here, in the city of Emmet, we're more valuable as tools than humans. Hush, child, she says, frowning, looking at me as if I'm the one in the wrong. I don't want her to know she is leaving me on the verge of death. My palms clam up, sweat beads at my forehead as I look for a way to leave without being rude. Guilt claws at me when Auntie Nawani makes a disappointed pout. She acts more like she's 7 rather than 70. I wish to be as carefree as she. The light above us flickers. Outside, the rest of the unit's electricity goes out. I check my Bluetooth connection that helps power all the other units. Disconnected. My aid all started as a way to make some extra cash on the side, but over time, somehow just became a favor I did for everyone. Whether it's compassion or guilt or pity, I much prefer to see everyone sharing what little resources we have rather than hoarding everything myself. Electricity is a luxury we can barely afford on the outskirts of Emmett. These shelters were not built by the government, but by those who couldn't afford the property rent in the city. But still, they charge us. A few of our neighbors peek out of their units. Some climb onto the intricate metal staircases that connect our honeycomb-like community under the bridge that stretches from the mouth of the city Emmett across this lake, leading into barren, infertile land. Many of us prefer it to the bustling noises of the city. With the city's overpopulation, they've become building homes and shelters wherever there is space, digging underground, growing upwards, or like our homes, under the bridge attached to its legs. There used to be houseboats floating across the lake until New Era's monopoly over all industries. They claimed the body of water as their own and complained about floating bodies and debris after heavy storms. They don't care about the dead, only the cost of fishing the corpses out and the resources to return them to their family. To New Era, people might as well be the plastic bottles floating in the lakes. Before those bioengineered to consume garbage in efforts to clear the growing landfills began risking their lives to fish them out of the water. Roaches. I wonder what names they might give people like me. A thundering of steps echoes out towards my unit. It was no doubt Nemo making her way in a zigzag up the 3 flights separating our homes. I check my battery again. 7%. All right, I'll stop there.
Thank you for sharing that with us, Ai. So this book obviously has AI as a theme. And you wrote this book before the whole AI and the arts debate got started. Would you have done anything differently had it been written today?
I think I would have kept it the same because the society depicted in IMI is well, has somehow become eerily similar to what many have feared about our own world when it comes to AI, in that it will like take over employment and labor of humans, or at least cheapen it, as well as potentially squandering lower cost side hustles. One thing I was concerned about, like because of the title, maybe there would be readers coming in and thinking I'd use AI in the creation of the project. Though I think similar to Linghun, where the focus is less on ghosts, but their impact on the living, my intention for IMI was to focus more so on the people and less so on the AI. So I suppose I wouldn't have done anything differently because at its core, it's still a story about toxic productivity and the ways it might like drive wedges between us and those we care about most.
Indeed, indeed. Again, if the audience has any questions, please do feel free to drop them in the chat. So IMI also takes on the themes of fascism and monopoly versus individualism. Can you elaborate a little bit on this and why you chose these as themes?
Oh, my answer is gonna be very long-winded for this one. Um, so it's funny because when I first started writing, one thing that people have always warned me about was not to be too political in my fiction. Um, but I find that in the act of writing itself, it is already political, and I'm sure other writers have said this as well. Um, to speak our minds and to write down our thoughts, whether it's concerning fabricated worlds or ones like closely connected to our own. There will be politics and social commentary or personal cultural touchstones, as well as values, beliefs, morals, and ethics, whether it is through a story that supports what we think or juxtaposes it through characters that are against the very fabric of what the writers believe themselves. Um, so I like to tackle political themes such as this one through a more philosophical and emotional sense, and the way they kind of impact humanity and relationship dynamics, and how these issues might impact like daily lives and make desolate what was previously mundane, warping the definition of what it means to simply live or to connect, to love, to make art, to live in a world with our surroundings and what it takes to survive rather than writing a story that is politics for the sake of politics. So in terms of like fascism and monopoly versus individualism, I won't name the big corporations, but we all know who they are and how they have been taking over much of the commercial market and the way they kind of like entice us, with convenience, like, oh, next hour delivery and things like that, and how more than ever we need to be consciously supporting local indie bookstores among like other small businesses and owners across industries. And there have been recent events, in publishing concerning large houses wanting to take over one another as well. Yet when it comes to monopolies, I feel like we lose a lot of the uniqueness that having several competitors within an industry might bring, like the way different artists have different styles or aesthetics, and similar to businesses, they have different aims and missions, approaches, and what they look for in the products they put out and the type of consumers they might attract. And if there is a monopoly, kind of like an IMI, we might lose a lot of that individualism, particularly ones that dictate every single industry and kind of like streamline style and voice.
Thank you for that. Not only does that very much ring true to me, but that's also a recipe for wonderful and powerful fiction. That's terrible advice to tell someone not to interject their feelings on different things. I mean, this is one of the reasons we write. Um, and I also appreciate that sentiment about indie bookstores. It's very difficult as a small bookstore owner to go up against one of the most powerful companies in the world, but a lot of us fight that fight every day. We have a question from Elle in the audience here. Do you think that humanity would win out over AI, presuming there's some kind of conflict, or are we doomed?
I think it depends on kind of like what kind of AI you are talking about, like the ones that people are saying become very humanoid-like, or things like, grammar programs that kind of have existed for a long time, or the ones that people have been using to kind of like do all the work for them and use it as like an excuse to kind of pay people less. And I feel like personally, especially with, the writer's strike going on and things like that, I do think we will win over AI, fingers crossed. Because I do think there's still kind of like a uniqueness and value to human created work that is like that cannot be replaced by things that are not infused with our emotional histories or cultures, or kind of scraping the internet for things to create new works, if that makes sense.
Here's another one from Tanya. As someone who writes about AI, what are your thoughts on the programming, i.e., glorified search engine technology being touted as artificial intelligence these days, in terms of human achievement and our tendency to glorify mediocrity? I have to say, I agree with Tanya there that it's not intelligent, it's machine learning, and there is a distinction there. But let's hear what you have to say about that.
Wait, I like missed the like the beginning of that. Could you repeat that?
Yes, of course. As someone who writes about AI, what are your thoughts on the programming, i.e., glorified search engine technology being touted as artificial intelligence?
So I've heard, well, I feel like I am not like an expert in this field, so I can't talk too much about it. But from what I heard from people using it, um, they say it is not the most accurate from what I've heard. They will try to search for things, but it will give them something else, or not a very full picture of what they're looking for, if that makes sense.
I'm sure it's going to change rapidly and in terrifying ways, but let's get back to the book. The book also takes on the dangers and pressures of productivity, or as you said, toxic productivity, and measuring the worth of an individual based on their output. Are these pressures that you feel in your life? And if so, how do you think that they're best handled, or for others feeling these pressures?
So I sometimes think that I might be one of the best examples of toxic productivity, and I'm sure that there are many who agree with me, because I think the longest I've ever stayed up might be like 60 hours with sporadic 1 hour naps, or 36 hours straight without any naps. And I'm here right now in the midst of COVID, so it's been a wild time, and I feel like it's almost as though like I've developed a trained immunity to rest. Um, but I do think what drives my own toxic productivity a lot of the times is the fear of disappointing others and like missing deadlines or asking for extensions. I remember in high school, I'd only ever asked for an extension once in the 4 years that I've been in school, or like, and that was like during the last month of the school where I was like physically and mentally could not take the pressure anymore. And similarly in university, there was like times where I'd sit on the ground outside of school buildings on the way home just to steal the Wi-Fi because the library had closed and I had like an hour left before the deadline, which far too many complicated citations I didn't have time for. Um, but I feel like because I was a very average student, I would say in the past, and did the bare minimum in terms of goals. Sometimes I think I've been overworking in the past 2 years, and before that, uh, to make up for this fact. Because before I was working as a ghostwriter, and the culture for that type of work very much was promoted as a write as fast as you can and as much as you can so you can make more kind of mindset. And I guess I'd brought that a bit, or maybe like all of it, into my fiction writing. Um, there's recently I wrote a story about a workplace that tricks its workers into waking up early every day, waking up a bit earlier every day and sleeping a bit later to increase work hours. But really, I feel like when I think about it, it's something that we also do to ourselves, isn't it? Um, and with like the recent discourses on age, it seems more and more important to understand that like success might come at any age, some earlier, some later, and that no one is going to have the same path. But then there's like that toxic productivity culture in the way that society tells us we might succeed that we will only like we must only succeed when we're young or else it's not worthwhile, which I don't think is true. Yet I still look at bestsellers who are like freshly out of college and university, or some who are still in their undergrad and wonder just how much harder I'd have to work to reach that stage. And I'm sure there are writers who look at me and think the same, and then writers who look at those writers and think the same. Um, and when I was looking at master's programs, I saw ones that specifically said you had to be under 25 to apply. And upon further investigation, there was like Reddit threads that talked about this exact same program and like programs of its nature that like favored quote unquote attractive and foreign applicants, which was wild. Yeah, and like especially with the fear of relevancy, there's like a need, especially for me, to produce and to produce like mass amounts without losing quality. Um, but like maybe one day my career might be stable enough, like Kazuo Ishiguro's, where I can maybe spend like 6 years between projects focusing on craft rather than trying desperately um, to not think about how to afford the time to write the next thing before the next sale. So yeah, but like on handling the pressures, I always like to say, do as I say, not as I do. So meditate, take naps, go on walks, exercise, listen to music, have like a DIY at home spa day, watch shows that are brain numbing or at least makes you laugh, whether it's humorous or because it's absurd. I like write a lot of things that are on the heavier end, I think. So having like lighthearted things in between helps. Recently I watched Joyride, which I highly recommend because I haven't laughed that hard in a long while. And though a fair warning, it's quite like a risque movie. Um, and anyways, I sometimes find myself randomly cleaning, and I feel like there's something like therapeutic about the repetitive task of just wiping table.
Well, I hope you take care of yourself. From everything I've read, there's been no dip in quality. In fact, you seem to get better as you go, which I think is
Oh.
characteristic of writing. And I think me and most other fans are willing to wait a little bit, so that you don't feel too pressured there. Um, so many of the characters in IMI are faced with losing their humanity in a very tangible way in some cases, because of a tech-dominated world. You talked a little bit about this earlier, but do you find this to be a real risk in today's world?
So I'm gonna talk about like kind of what I witnessed in my own personal perspective. But personally, I do think so, or at least I think tech might drastically change the definition of humanity and what it might entail, especially when it comes to things like connection and community interaction and public speaking and identity and agency. Um, I feel like there was once a time where community took the form of only in-person interactions, of like planning outings, of like going on walks, of sitting outside of homes and chatting on warm breeze evenings and like wet rain falls. Um, but now there's like a screen between a lot of it, kind of like between us now, even though it does mean we are able to connect with more people around the world of different time zones and places. We're also missing a lot of like the physical cues and intimacies and learning how to pick up those in-person social cues. In things I've heard parents mention about their children who were introduced to school through online classes rather than in-person classroom experiences as well. But I've also found that with the increasing use of tech, I've been becoming worse at peopling, as in it like makes me anxious, like the potential awkward silences of meeting up with people in real life, the commute, the overwhelming surrounding sensory details, or like the bombardment of like different cues you have to pay attention to, or some people miss out on. And I'm sure it's not just me that feels this way, though I do think it's helped me kind of overcome public speaking in the sense that through a screen, I feel less anxious about talking in front of crowds, just so because you don't see everyone at once either, right? Um, but I do think the ability to just socialize, to come together as a community is part of what makes us human. And technology does seem to both aid and take away from it. Um, And like another take, I feel like on branding and influences and online presence, which we talk a lot about as authors too, um, is interesting because more and more we see in not just publishing that there is a need for a brand or like a specific image that people need to uphold, whether it is an influencer who is like cool and edgy or the internet sweetheart or the diva. And I feel like technology feeds into these identity fabrications or maybe like enunciations, if that makes sense. If someone's already that person, it kind of like, exaggerates it, particularly when it comes to commercialization of a figure. But we see that it feeds into an increased vulnerability of people who become hypervisible in the online sphere through technology. For example, the way Billie Eilish had changed its style and kind of like receives some like negative responses due to that, or Blackpink's appearance on the show The Idol. But I will let people Google those on their own. And I did want to note that technology itself, language itself is also a technology, but we can save that conversation for maybe another time in another story.
I think about that frequently, so I would love to have an in-depth conversation about that. Um, so off script a little bit here, but I'm curious, when you talk about productivity and pressure, do you ever write things privately for yourself without the intention to publish as a way to kind of cleanse that palate?
I Yes and no, if that makes sense. I feel like everything I write is more or less for myself, and when I edit it, it is for others, if that makes sense. So it's like, the first draft, you are telling yourself the story and you're writing for yourself. And then when it finally goes out and people are pointing out all the things that they want to know more about or want you to add to the story, that's kind of like for the other people. So I've tried to find a balance, I think. So then I'm like always writing things I actually like to write. So when I'm selling it, it doesn't feel like I'm just like selling product, if that makes sense.
It makes total sense, and I asked because, I wrote a book this year that I will probably never let anyone read. I had to do it, and I'm always curious with other writers if they go through that because, of course, um, while it's the arts, it's also a job, but it's an interesting place to try and find a balance for. So, another theme in this book is growing cold and callous to be able to face adversity. Um, how do you think as humans we can avoid this and remain hopeful?
So I think read, write, and talk to people, because I like to believe that there are many more people bringing light to the world than darkness. Though even in bleakness, I feel like we can often find hope. And to also check on the people you care about, even if briefly, just like a quick message, because that momentary display of care could mean a lot to someone who is feeling alone. I've been noticing that there are more workplaces and opportunities that take care of their employees in terms of mental health, doing check-ins, offering help, but there is very much still places where favoritism towards those who can work longer, harder, more efficiently, or like the quick learners and persistent climbers, um, and the existence that of people who like might step on others to reach the top rather than dropping down a ladder or reaching down a hand to help others up. And and those who believe like victory for one cannot mean victory for all, but I think it can and it should. Um, there are many writers at the beginning of my career. I guess I'm still kind of at the beginning if you think about it though, that encouraged me and believed in me and my work, that extended opportunities my way and passed along my names to those I otherwise would not have been able to connect with. And I hope I can kind of like pay that kindness forward. And I think as long as there are still people who are willing to help others, there is hope.
Absolutely. And I've found it to be fairly unique in the science fiction field, the attitude of paying it forward, where each generation does reach out to help the next coming up, which is as it should be, a positive sum gain for all. It's totally doable. It's weird. I think particularly here in the States, there's this sports mentality of there has to be a winner and a loser. And that seems insane, where I think of life more as music, where we collaborate and do something together to make something more beautiful than what the individual can do.
Hmm.
So, similar in ways to your last book, IMI deals with the pressures of family responsibility, both financially and at times having to put oneself second. Um, but finding strength within this setup. Can you elaborate a little bit on that theme? I know we talked a little bit about that last time you were on the program, but I felt in this book it was dealt with very beautifully through the sacrifices.
So yes, this will be a kind of different approach, I suppose, to family and responsibility. So recently, I made a joke that wasn't really a joke on Twitter about close relatives asking me to buy them houses after learning that I published a book, which we all know, unless it's like a bestseller, or most times, even if it is a bestseller, it's more likely than not we won't be able to buy a house, or even less so, several houses, which apparently my wait list is 10 houses now with our royalties. There's a saying, however, that runs in the family to aim for the level of success that might allow you to buy your parents a house or several houses to show your filial piety and as a way to thank them and kind of show your gratitude for raising you. But outside of that, I feel like responsibility when it comes to family, some are avoidable, most are not. That might come in the form of taking care of relatives when they're sick, or helping out family in terms of income, or things like spending a day finding a specific handbag that a fashionista relative desires while on vacation. To what we have in IMI, which is kind of a sort of carry on generational debt and with it often generational traumas. Um, in some cases, there is no choice, but I think in finding strength in choicelessness, particularly in a rather oppressive and desolate world, family found or blood bound might be the only thing that grounds our survival because it might be the case, like I mentioned earlier, where success of one might mean success for all.
And I've also noticed that a lot of your work takes on the theme and the realities of vulnerability versus strength, and how these two conflicting feelings can interact with each other. How do you find a balance between these feelings for your character and personally, if you want to go into that?
Um, so I feel like a lot of my stories do have that personal edge to them, and that I like draw a lot on myself and on the people around me. So I feel like humans are complex, and so are characters, whether they are human or not. And I suppose when it comes to writing strength versus vulnerability and how the two interact with each other, I kind of look at the people around me as examples, like how when someone says something but they really mean something else, and what it is about their demeanor that reveals perhaps fear behind their unwavering words, or the strength in the way they express their vulnerabilities as though they are not a fear like not afraid of their weaknesses and only afraid of hiding them. So I suppose it is kind of a blend of the internal and the external, and how they might illuminate one another through reinforcement or contradictions.
Have you ever encountered author Brene Brown, a sociologist that writes about vulnerability? Uh,
No.
we'll have to talk about that later. She's a wonderful advocate for the strength of vulnerability, and
Ah.
this book made me think of her work. So yeah, you might want to check her out. So what's coming up next for you? What are you currently working on? Is there a break in sight for you? What's coming next?
I've been saying that, like, I will have a break next month since the beginning of 2020, and there have not been yet. But I am hoping, fingers crossed, that this December I will have a break. Question mark. We will see. Um, but I feel like So like I just finished my first novel and it is a weird mix of like eco-punk and cli-fi and cyber mixed with biopunk, and it's kind of like a post-apocalyptic science fantasy inspired by Chinese opera traditions. And I'm currently working on the edits for that before it goes on sub with my agent. And then the project I'll be tackling for the rest of this year after the novel edits is a romantic tragedy horror novel or novella. I haven't decided yet. Um, Inspired by Fujianese wedding traditions and like ghost weddings in general. And then I'll loop around to write the novel version of Give Me English. At least that is the plan so far.
That's all very exciting. I'm particularly excited for the novel based on Chinese opera. I love Chinese opera, and it's something that doesn't come up very often. Took me a while to learn to love it because it's so foreign to the Western ear, but it's wonderful, lovely, and an amazing high art form, higher than ballet. I can't wait to see what you've done with this. Um, I thank you so much for joining us tonight. Thank you for another wonderful book. For anyone who has not read it, please go out and get I Am I. There's also a link in the chat where you can pick it up. It's new from Shortwave Publishing. And if you want more science fiction, on the 25th of July, we are going to have our next Flash Science Fiction Night featuring AC Wise, FJ Bergman, and Marie Vibert. So that's going to be another wonderful night. Thank you, Thank you to our audience. I will drop a link in the chat for that next event, and we hope to see you all next time.
Thank you all for coming.